Hey guys, today we're going to talk more about perception. Hi, I'm Peter Blaine. Now this is part 2, so if you didn't see part 1, it might be a good idea to go back and look at that one first. But in part 1, I was talking about the enactive approach, which is a lesser known way of explaining perception and other aspects of cognition. Now it's interesting to know how perception works for a lot of reasons, but it's particularly important if you want to create good user interfaces. Because if you want to communicate information into the mind of the user through a UI, you need to interface with the visual perceptual system. There's no other way into somebody's brain. So unless you know how the human perceptual system really works, you're at a disadvantage. In part 1, I said that perception is something we do. It's a way of acting in the world. It's not a process of extracting information and constructing internal representations. And people often struggle with this because when we see something, say a cat, we seem to have the experience in our head. It's similar when we imagine a cat. When we close our eyes and imagine what a cat looks like, we also seem to get an image in our head. These images in our head lead a lot of people to think that we have an internal representation forming in our brain. So when I say there are no internal representations, it can seem counterintuitive or even computationally implausible. But while there are no internal representations, there are computational structures in the brain. And I say computational in inverted commas because a brain works nothing like a digital computer. But we can store memories and contemplate things in their absence and perform other cognitive functions. And all of this needs an explanation. But first I'd like to comment on this idea of images in our head, because it's a misleading phrase and it causes confusion. The reason we feel like there are images in our head when we look at an object or when we imagine an object, it's not because there are internal representations in our brain, and it's not even because our brain is in our head. It's because our primary sense organs are in our head. Our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, our inner ear that senses balance, all of these senses are in our head. And that's why we feel like we have images in our head. And it's why we feel like our consciousness is in our head. It's nothing to do with the location of our brain, and it's nothing to do with internal representations in our brain. Our brain could be in a jar on the shelf, and we would still feel like our thoughts are in our head if that's where our primary sense organs are. I might talk more about this in a different video because it's a big topic. But for now, I just want to warn you about the misleading phrase, images in our head. But there are informational structures in the nervous system, and these structures are known as schemata, or schemas, depending on what you think the plural of schema is. But in this context, schemata is more conventional. So, what are schemata and how do they differ from internal representations? Well, schemata are the structures that guide perceptual activity and that are changed and modified by the feedback that results from that action. I mentioned Ulrich Nieser in part 1. He's the founder of cognitive psychology, and he wrote this book, Cognition and Reality, among other ones. But here he describes what he refers to as the perceptual cycle. If a person is viewing an object, let's say a cat, the person is performing a set of exploratory actions. Now we're talking about visual perception here, so the exploration involves eye movements, head movements, perhaps moving towards and away from the object, perhaps moving around it. These exploratory actions deliver feedback to the retina, which is how the system samples the environment. This in turn modifies the schema and drives further action and feedback. So as the person engages in this schema-driven exploratory activity, he is engaging in visual perception. This is what visual perception is. And the schema is changed by this activity. So if the person is looking at a particular cat with some particular characteristics, say it has an unusual pattern on its fur, the schema adapts and transforms itself, forming a new schema. And this is how we remember what an object looks like, even if we haven't seen that particular object before. But the schema is not an internal representation. Nothing ever accesses the schema in place of the object the way a digital computer performs operations on data in place of the real-world entities that the data represents. There's no need for an internal representation of the object because the world acts as its own external representation. Why would the brain construct an internal representation of the cat and access that when it can access the cat directly? And the enactive approach makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint too. It's hard to imagine how a simple nervous system designed to respond directly to the environment could make the evolutionary leap to work like a digital computer with data structures and so on. But it's not so hard to imagine how it might have evolved to store sensory-motor feedback relationships. Schemata and the perceptual cycle can also explain mental imagery, human creativity, and cognition more broadly. But I don't want to get too far ahead. For now, we'll stay on visual perception. So if we think of perception as exploratory activity driven by schemata, we can begin to understand why perception has the characteristics that it does. So, for example, it can explain attention. Most of us have had the experience of looking for something, say in the fridge, and not being able to see it. This happens to some more than others, and I'm particularly bad. But say we're looking for a block of cheese in the fridge and we just can't see it. And then someone points out that it's right in front of us. How could we not have seen the cheese when we were looking directly at it? Well, if seeing the cheese involves a cheese exploring schema that directs exploratory action resulting in feedback to the perceptual cycle, and if we aren't executing that schema-driven plan correctly and in coordination with the cheese, we don't see the cheese. Doesn't matter that it's right in front of us with our eyes pointed directly at it. That isn't enough for perception. We don't see the cheese until we actively engage it with our eyes in a coordinated way. The same way we don't know what the cheese feels like until we pick it up and manipulate it in our hands in a coordinated way. Both forms of perception require active and correctly coordinated exploration. We can explain filtering in a similar way. If we're looking at a cat, the cat will not usually be on an empty background. The cat might be on a couch, or it might be playing with a ball of wool, or there might be a pot plant in the scene. If the traditional account of perception were true, we'd need a process to filter out all these superfluous visual signals to separate the cat from the other elements of the scene. Otherwise, we wouldn't see a cat on the couch. We'd just see a lot of visual information and we wouldn't know where the cat begins and where it ends. But if we think of perception in terms of the enactive approach, we don't need to explain how the superfluous information is filtered out. Nisa says it's like a theory of apple picking doesn't require a theory of not picking the apples that aren't picked. So in order to distinguish the cat from everything else, we need to do what we do when we see a cat and not do the other things. So we execute the cat perceiving schema and we don't execute schemata related to couches, balls of wool, or pot plants. If we don't engage in the activity of visually exploring these other things, we don't see them. Just like we didn't see the cheese in the fridge. So nothing needs to be filtered out. Now this implies that we see less of what's around us than the traditional account of perception would predict. But it feels like we see everything. We feel like we have this panoramic movie playing out in our heads as we look around our environment. But it's really not true. Take a look at the following change blindness experiment. In this experiment, an element of the scene is changing after each flicker. Now most people take a while to see what's changing, even though it's really obvious once you see what it is. Now take a look and see if you can detect what's changing. If we see everything that's in front of us, the change should be obvious. But it isn't. Most people take a while to see it. And I'll put a link down the bottom to this animation in case you haven't seen what's changing yet. But trust me, it's really obvious once you see it, and the fact that it's hard to detect is a big problem for the traditional account of perception. So we see less of our surroundings than we think. And if you tune into how little you're actually seeing, it can be really disconcerting. But unless you tune into it, it definitely feels like we see everything. And this is because wherever we look, we see something. If I look in one direction, I see the video camera. If I look in another direction, I see the microphone. If I turn around and look behind me, I'll see the whiteboard. Wherever I look, wherever I focus my attention, I see something. It's like the fridge light always appears to be on. The same thing applies to attention. Whichever direction I look, wherever I focus my attention, I see something. So it feels like I see everything. But it's really not so. In reality, we see much less than we think. But how could we survive if this were true? If we see so little? Well, our perceptual system is highly evolved and it's so tuned into the environment that it attends to the things that it most likely needs to attend to. And it uses a whole array of mechanisms to achieve this. And a really obvious one is motion. If something moves, it's probably worth looking at. So we're very sensitive to motion. And this is why it's hard to see changes in change blindness experiments. The flicker interrupts the attention-grabbing mechanism that normally detects change or movement. And so we don't see what's changing. But unless you intentionally disrupt these mechanisms, the perceptual system is so tuned into subtle cues that we feel like we're seeing everything. So a perceptual system uses compensatory mechanisms to decide what to attend to. Now, as a designer of user interfaces, we can exploit these mechanisms to influence what users see and how they think about things, and ultimately to guide behaviors. Just because a web page has a particular element or feature, and just because it's apparently staring the user in the face, does not guarantee that the user will see it or interact with it in the way we expect them to. And this is because visual perception is not just a matter of having something in front of you. It's an active exploratory process driven by schemata that needs to be executed correctly before something is seen. In other videos, I'll give examples of how we can use this to influence perception and behavior. So if you'd like to see more videos on this topic, you are very welcome to click the subscribe button. And thanks for watching.